Good afternoon. This is week 4 of our class on nonviolence and social movements. And we are very honored today to have my very good friend, Bill Lucy, who will be speaking. You just saw him featured in the film At the River I Stand. Bill Lucy rose to national prominence during the Memphis sanitation workers' strike in 1968. He was a young organizer at the time, and he was assigned to help provide guidance and leadership for this momentous strike. And he worked very closely with Reverend James Lawson Jr. during the course of the Memphis sanitation workers' strike. This was to be a friendship that would last more than 60 years. Bill Lucy became the Secretary Treasurer of the American Federation of State, County, and Municipal Employees. He has emerged as a national leader who has provided a progressive vision for the US labor movement. He went on to found and to be the president of the Coalition of Black Trade Unionists that was established back in 1972, and for decades helped to inspire Black worker organizing and labor and community alliances to advance civil and human rights throughout the country. This year, we are celebrating the 30th anniversary of the founding of the Asian Pacific American Labor Alliance. And just as we were getting started, I looked up my good friend Bill Lucy to give us advice on what we needed to do to advance a organization within the labor movement to represent the interests of people of color. And I still remember his words 30 years ago and his counsel and advice to us. And over these decades, we have always turned to Bill Lucy for leadership and for guidance and for inspiration. So I would like to welcome you, Bill Lucy, to our class at UCLA on nonviolence and social movements, and to thank you again for your many years of courageous leadership within the labor movement.
Thank you so much, Ken, for asking me to be a part of today. It's really a very exciting thing for me personally. And I can't help but just thank you and Jim and so many folks for just giving us inspiration to keep pushing. I'm just excited to be with you.
Thank you so much. So I know that the 1968 Memphis sanitation workers strike was a history-making campaign. And I wanted to ask how you first were called upon by the American Federation of State, County, and Municipal Employees to engage in that campaign.
Well, I suffer the problem that a lot of staff guys suffer. You're in the wrong place at the wrong time, and the president calls and says, "What are you doing tomorrow?" And you make the mistake of saying nothing. So I was asked to go to Memphis. Now, Memphis was home for me. Jerry Worth, who was president at the time, called and said, if you're not busy tomorrow, I'd like for you to go to Memphis. I hear there's going to be at least some kind of confrontation. Find out what's going on and see what we can do. And I was at that time assigned to work in Detroit. We were not doing organizing, we were just building stronger and stronger union to represent members we already had. So the following day, I headed for Memphis. I got there, and when I was told what was going on, I have to honestly say it didn't really seem like it was the kind of issue that was going to be a long time struggle. These were workers who had worked the better part of their adult life for the city of Memphis. They were sanitation workers, and they were workers in the water department and the Department of Public Works. you couldn't believe the conditions that these employees worked under. And in 1968, you would have really thought that employers were enlightened enough to know that there were some basic things that they were responsible for doing. You had men who had worked 15, 20 years for the city of Memphis, and their wages were, $1.45, $1.50 an hour. The conditions under which they worked was just beyond belief. And when I saw what was going on, it didn't seem like anything other than a good conversation would resolve these issues. But the city had a fellow by the name of Loeb, was the mayor. And in all honesty, he wasn't about to sit down and discuss working conditions or what have you with Black workers in the Public Works Department, and particularly in the sanitation department itself. So I had a meeting along with a fellow who worked for the rubber workers union in Memphis, Tennessee. And I simply thought, well, why don't we just go down to City Hall, sit with the mayor, explain to him what he obviously don't know, and see if we couldn't find a solution to what essentially was really not a difficult issue. The mayor was not about to have a conversation with sanitation workers. And he said what a lot of leadership in the South always says is, if not for you troublemakers, all of this would work itself out. And he says, I have always had a way of working with these men. If they want to come down to City Hall, I'd be glad to talk to them. So I want to make sure I understood him. You mean to say that you will talk with these men? He says, yeah. So we went back to the Union Hall and picked up about 900 of them and marched them down to City Hall to meet with the mayor. The mayor went into what essentially I have to say was just he went bonkers to think that he would sit down across the table from sanitation workers and have a discussion about what we ought to do about working conditions in the city of Memphis, Tennessee. What I thought was going to be a simple proposition turned into one of the great struggles of all time for low-wage workers, no-wage workers, as they try to find a way to change their circumstances in their situation. The strike clearly was on. And most strikes, Kent, as you know, they start over something that could be resolved quickly if the power side wanted to resolve it. On February 1st in Memphis, two men who worked for the Public Works Department, in particular the sanitation department, Robert Walker and Echol, was killed in the back of their sanitation truck. And it was, nobody thought much about it. It was like business as usual. But it became the catalyst for the men saying, we've simply had enough. And we're simply not going to work any longer under these conditions. And like any place, it's not hard to start a strike. It's really hard to end the strike. And we simply tried to think through what it was that we were dealing with. But the men simply had made up their mind they would no longer work under those conditions. So I, along with a fellow by the name of P.J. Champa, and a young fellow who really did so much to help the strike, a fellow by the name of Jesse Epps. Perhaps you've heard the name, but the four of us simply set out to see what we could do to bring some change in working conditions of these men. 1,300 of them simply refused to go back to work. And the strike was on. The strike was on. It ultimately lasted 67 days, but so many things can happen during the course of the strike. For the first time, I met one of the greatest people I have ever come to know, and that was James Lawson. I'm not altogether sure how Jim found out about what was going on, but he didn't waste any time getting himself engaged to try and bring some support to these striking workers. So many things happen that now, in years past, you wonder why. Young student, I should say, high school student, young fellow by the name of Larry Payne, simply got emotionally caught up in the strike, wanted to help men work, the workers. Memphis police shot him point blank, killed him. He had nothing to do with the strike other than wanting to help. Those were the conditions that these men worked under. And for myself personally, it's one of the great struggles and one of the things that bring you joy that you're able just to make a little bit of a difference in the lives of these kinds of workers. Memphis, Tennessee, and the South in general, the kind of work they did essentially was almost reserved for Black workers and Black men. And to find a way to make a change, some change in their lives is really the role, in my opinion, of organized labor. And I think we did the Lord's work. I think we did the Lord's work. Jim joined the struggle and, like always, put heart, soul, and everything into it. And I would say, if not for Jim Lawson, we might still be on strike in Memphis, Tennessee.
Well, thank you so much, Bill, for sharing those memories of how you were recruited by the president of AFSCME to go to Memphis, and how this death of 2 sanitation workers due to unsafe working conditions prompted 1,300 men to walk out, and also to link this issue not only of worker abuse, but police abuse with the killing of Larry Payne, and how that also really encouraged more of the striking workers to stand firm in their demand for justice. You know, the slogan that emerged, "I am a man," resonated nationally. And I was wondering if you could speak to how that particular slogan emerged through the Memphis sanitation workers strike.
Well, Kent, you know, down south, Black folks can go from boy to uncle to grandfather without ever being recognized as a man. This was not an economic strike. This was a strike about recognition, and recognition so that they could sit with someone who had the authority to deal with the problems that they had on a daily basis. The death of Robert Walker and Echol, these were not the first times that men were killed in the line of duty, but nothing ever happened. It was business as usual. And I think they simply said they had had enough. What we wound up doing was really putting together one of the broadest community organizing efforts that I had ever known. I was, you know, in California, in Richmond, where I lived prior to coming to work for the union. We thought community organizing was a basic thing, but it had never happened in a city like Memphis. No one had thought about how a trade union could reach out to and appeal to the community to help working men find change in their lifestyle. So those of us who were staff people for the union, we said, this is going to have to be a total effort to mobilize and organize the community to bring these workers some assistance, because in all honesty, the community itself never gave much thought to the problems that these workers had. Yet the total sanitation department was all Black, but it was not one that people thought much about. I mean, it's not like, you put the garbage outside and it disappears. Well, until we talked about the conditions under which these men worked, nobody really gave it much thought. And I think, again, I keep coming back to Jim. Well, when we talked about this, they're going to work at 4:30 or 5 o'clock in the morning. They don't have a place to shower. They don't have a place to eat lunch. They don't have a place to change clothes. And these are just basic things that ought to near to any group of workers. So when we began to talk about these, we began to see a change in the mindset of the religious community, because they'd never given it much thought. We began to see a change in the side of the business Black community, because they never gave it much thought. And here were men who worked every single day, yet could not change or alter their situation. They didn't have anybody to talk to about safety equipment. They didn't have anyone to talk to about safety gear or safety procedures. It was like these were things that were not a part of the workforce's entitlement. And when we really began to see more and more, it was clear. I mean, the city of Memphis and many other cities across the South, but Memphis was one point. There was no recognition at all for the role of Black workers. So the question was, and Jim and other pastors made the point that if you don't speak to people like their people, that's almost a racist approach to your relationship. So there was a Canadian pastor, a fellow by the name of Malcolm Blackburn. Malcolm and I were tasked with finding some way to put glue into this process. And we sat down and played with words for 2 or 3 hours one evening. And we came up with the slogan, "I am a man." And it was an effort to get these men to see themselves as something more than chattel slavery. I mean, men who did some of the most difficult work and didn't complain about it. I mean, it wasn't pleasant, but what they wanted to be is treated with respect and to have dignity and appreciation for what they did. And when we put that word out there, it took about 24 hours before it had just lit up the entire city. Black men are demanding to be treated with respect, to be treated as men. This was a very new relationship that they were saying that they were going to build for themselves. I mean, they wanted a raise in pay, but that was not the issue. The issue is just treat me with respect in light of what I do for this city. And even an old timer like me felt proud that these men were themselves deciding that they were going to be treated as men and treated with respect.
Well, it's extraordinary, Bill, that you are one of the ones that helped to come up with that slogan, which so captured the spirit and energy and determination of the Memphis sanitation workers of 1968, but also came to exemplify the merger of the labor movement and of the civil rights movement. That simple slogan, "I am a man," has been captured in books, in films, in every single museum in the country as a symbol of this merger between the labor movement and the civil rights movement. So if you could tell me what are the factors that led to this alliance? Because as you know, for someone who has fought for racial justice within the labor movement for so many years, this was not a natural partnership. And so what do you think were the critical elements to forge this alliance between labor and Black workers?
Well, Dr. King had for years been an incredible advocate for working people, and particularly the low-wage workers and workers who had really no one to speak for them. And Dr. King said at 63, 64, somewhere there, that labor and religion are two of the most powerful forces in our society. And that if we can figure out how to make each work together for the good of their constituency, you would see change. And you see power come to those workers who were on the lower end of the scale. So our union, the American Federation of State, County, and Municipal Employees, had really, since 1953, been pushing hard to build power within the community and build strong unions to represent and speak for really the most downtrodden of workers. Whether that would be Philadelphia, Detroit, New York, other cities where the Black workforce was at the bottom of the scale, the bottom of the room. And if we could put these two groups together, we could possibly not only build unions strong enough to change the conditions under which Black and poor workers worked, but could build strong unions. And again, Jerry Worth, who came out of New York, was very committed to building unions for the lowest paid workers. He was committed to it. So all of these things, some of us who were lucky enough to be a part of that early movement, we learned from him. And we learned how to convince people that they're entitled. They're entitled to be treated with respect and with dignity. They were workers like anyone else and entitled to the same kind of respect. In the 50s, this idea caught hold. We were organizing 50 plus thousand workers per year, new workers joining public sector unions and becoming a part of a new group of workers who saw themselves not just being public employees, but employees with the same entitlement as private sector employees who were doing, in many cases, the same kind of work, getting treated much differently, wages better, conditions of employment better, and the recognition of their rights better. And our union sort of grew out of the disrespect that employers had for public employees in those days.
I'm so glad, Bill, that you lifted up the whole issue of public sector worker organizing, because that has been a major part of your contribution to the U.S. labor movement. That, with the sanitation workers, not only were they Black workers. So they were dealing with issues of racism and discrimination. They were also workers in a right-to-work state, which was so pervasive throughout the South that undermined and eliminated basic rights of workers to form and join unions. But number three, they were also public sector workers who historically had been excluded from labor law protections in this country that were passed back in the 1930s for private sector workers only. So could you tell me about the challenges, especially back then, in public sector worker organizing and how the sanitation workers' victory represented such a breakthrough?
Well, public sector workers who were specifically excluded from the National Labor Relations Act. I mean, we had no rights to organize, and public employers had no responsibility for bargaining with us. So public sector workers were on the low end of the totem pole. And throughout the South, particularly, the worst jobs are almost reserved for Black workers and other workers of color. And so so many of us decided, what is the difference between a truck driver who drives for a private entity and one who drives for a public entity if their needs were the same, if their skills were the same, if they were doing essentially the same job? We're entitled to be treated with the same recognition and respect as any other set of workers. So it was around those kinds of theories that we organized. And you would find, whether it was Louisiana or throughout the South, the worst jobs almost reserved for workers of color. And we said that if we can bring people to think of themselves as workers entitled to be treated with respect and dignity, they will organize, and they did. For many years, I mean, wherever we went, people were looking for ways and means to improve their work life. And to this day, as we learn more and more about the shortcomings of public sector workers and how the law and policy and custom denies them the right to issues that private sector workers take as a matter of granted. People are saying, I want to organize. I want to be a part of a union to speak with regards to policies and conditions that affect my work life. I want to be treated like a worker who have the opportunity to express themselves in the political and social policies that speak to my condition. So while some may say how hard it is for labor, it is easy enough to organize workers if they themselves know they want to be organized and can organize. The incredible story a couple of weeks ago of a couple of guys who organized Amazon. I mean, an incredible piece of work done by a couple of young kids who saw them, I should call them kids, I apologize, but young men who saw their right to have a union and form a union to deal with the problems that they saw, whether it's the pandemic or anything else. They are entitled to organize and fight. Well, I mean, that's what it's all about. That's what it's all about.
Well, thanks so much for linking it, because I do think that in many ways, this Amazon organizing victory in Staten Island was that very type of a breakthrough victory where, you're dealing with one of the wealthiest corporations in the world that has done everything they could to prevent their workers from organizing and forming a union. And yet, these workers in Staten Island stepped forward and challenged Amazon and won. And so it's that type of energy that we saw also with the Memphis sanitation workers strike, that here they were going up against generations of racism and discrimination, generations of anti-union and anti-worker policies in the South, and denial of basic rights for public sector workers, that these were three huge obstacles. And yet the victory of the sanitation workers of Memphis was such a boost to organizing of Black workers, organizing of public sector workers, and organizing in the South. So it's no accident that over half a century later, people are still talking about the power, the impact, the significance of this campaign that you helped to lead. I want to reflect back on the decision to call in Dr. King, to have him come and march with the sanitation workers. Could you tell me about how that decision was made and what the impact of Dr. King in Memphis meant?
Well, the civil rights movement, as led by Dr. King, Dr. King was a strong advocate for workers' rights. And the newspaper writers they called him a civil rights fighter right away, but there was an incredible reluctance to call him a labor leader, because the implications of that and what they knew would happen, they would call him a labor leader all day. I'm sorry, a civil rights leader all day. But there was an incredible reluctance to recognize his ability to organize workers. Dr. King was in the process of organizing the Poor People's Campaign in 1968. And his view was to bring working people, poor people, to Washington, D.C. and put a face on poverty, put a face on the downtrodden and those who are not given an opportunity to improve their station in life. When you think about it, the National Labor Relations Act, and I'd fight for it every day, but it has great ability to help those who are already well off. It has an incredible inability to help those who are not well off. Low wage, poor workers gain very little from the National Labor Relations Act. You could organize 5,000 workers and it would take you an equal amount of time to get to the bargaining table to take advantage of your victory. And so Dr. King was going to bring poor people to Washington, D.C. so that the policymakers could see what they look like, irrespective of race, color, creed, ethnicity. But there are people who work every day, but still could not raise themselves out of poverty. 40% of the sanitation workers' family live below the poverty line, yet they worked every day. They worked every day, but could not change their condition. So when Dr. King heard about what was taking place in Memphis, he saw the ultimate contradiction. Workers who work every day, but still can't raise themselves out of poverty. Workers who work every day, but still cannot improve the quality of their lives, or the lives of their family, or their children. So in effect, as our strike went on, we asked civil rights leadership, NAACP, SCLC, SNCC, all of those who understood the struggle that these men and men like them were going through, could they help? And Jim Lawson, who was a great ally of Dr. King, spelled out for Dr. King what was taking place in Memphis, Tennessee, and could he identify with the struggle that was there? Well, in kind of an irony, Dr. King understood instantly what was taking place. The poor was fighting with itself to remain poor. Those who were better off, the machinists, all of the high-skilled jobs, they were allowed to organize. They were allowed to build a union. They were allowed to sit down and bargain. But the workers who needed to organize could not. No employer was bound to respond to the needs of working people on the low end of the scale. So Dr. King identified with that struggle. And by so doing, religious leadership like him began to understand that this is a much more complicated struggle than we have ever thought about. And it was Jim, pastors like Jim, and certainly Dr. King, who spoke to the needs of the working poor. And I just sort of feel so blessed to have been able to be a part of that and be able to convince these workers that they had the power and they had to strengthen the commitment to change their conditions. And as you say, Memphis was sort of a door opener in so many places where workers had worked the better part of their adult life and still lived in poverty.
Well, thank you very much for affirming Dr. King's role, not only as a civil rights leader, but also as a worker justice leader. Absolutely. And he so eloquently talked about that link and was so firmly and deeply committed to worker justice. And so tragically, the very last campaign that he was involved in was the Memphis sanitation workers. And that's where he was assassinated back on April 4th, 1968. So I do think that in all of the ways that the media and the historians have pigeonholed and very much narrowed, Dr. King's legacy and his focus is a disservice. And the way you have, accurately talked about Dr. King's leadership as a voice for justice, as a voice for civil and human rights, but also as a voice for worker rights and worker justice. And so I do think that, capturing that legacy of Dr. King has been such an important contribution. And I wanted to build on that because you went on to help to launch the Coalition of Black Trade Unionists just a few years later, back in 1972. So I want to, if you could talk for a minute about what motivated you and others to launch the Coalition of Black Trade Unions and how you chose to develop a plan of action to represent the interests of Black workers within this country.
Kent, most of us had spent a good deal of time being a part of a movement just really attempting to change the perception of people of color and their role in our society. And in 1968, we witnessed so many contradictory things, whether it's the war in Southeast Asia or whether it was the civil rights movement across the South and across the North, whether it was the fight for social justice that we all took a part of. I mean, we kept trying to figure out what is it that's going wacky. It may not be a good word, but we've seen the effort to integrate the South. We've seen the efforts to integrate institutions of higher learning. We've seen all of that, but nobody ever really made it a real effort to talk about how these things are just so debilitating on just people who are just trying to have a better life. Whether it was James Meredith or whether it was a cousin, Arthurine Lucy. I mean, it never was an issue that the American labor movement felt bound to use its power and its strength to attempt to change. Well, in '68, Hubert Humphrey, who was just an incredible political leader and social justice advocate, he was defeated by Richard Nixon, and as time marched on a little bit, some of us who were trade unionists simply said, well, the American labor movement really ought to be on the right side of history in these issues. And the AFL-CIO, while I guess maybe it was their right, they had a right to be neutral in a political contest for the presidency of the United States. Well, some of us thought that George McGovern, you could really tell the difference between George McGovern and Richard Nixon. I mean, it didn't require an awful lot of study. But if you took a policy position of neutrality, it meant that you really didn't think an awful lot about the implications of a position of neutrality to a substantial portion of the workforce. A portion of the workforce that was low pay, a portion of the workforce that was hard to find jobs, a portion of the workforce that, as they said, last in, first out. So the position of neutrality for some of us who were labor leadership, men like Nelson Jack Edwards of the United Auto Workers, a vice president at the time, men like Charlie Hayes, who was the vice president of the United Food and Commercial Workers at the time. We simply said that there's something fundamentally unfair about the House of Labor not understanding the implications of a Richard Nixon and what his programs and policies would mean to so many people who simply wanted a better opportunity. And the Federation took a position of neutrality, and we said we simply will not support that. We will not follow it. We will not support it. And secondarily, we will put our chips on George McGovern, whether he won or didn't win. That's where we will stand. And the houses rumbled, and people could not understand the implications of a position of neutrality for Black and workers of color. And so we said that we're going to do something about this. And we did. I mean, our fight was not a fight about organized labor. Our fight was about a fight of organized labor to recognize the implications of some of their policies on us. If there's a right to work fight, workers of color are the first ones to step up and risk their jobs trying to help workers who have access to full collective bargaining, the right to organize. All of the issues that are beneficial to workers of color are the first to step up and struggle to improve the conditions of everybody. And so we simply said that the time has come for us to step up. Now, we intentionally call this the Coalition of Black Trade Unionists. This was not an accident. Part of our thinking was in 1968, if you can't recognize who you are, what you are, there's something more fundamentally wrong with our system. And we were not setting ourselves aside. We simply wanted to be recognized for what we were. And there were those who said that we wouldn't work together for a half hour. Well, we're now 51 years and still going at it. We thought that our movement, Coalition of Black Trade Unions, and our movement, the AFL-CIO, had a fundamental responsibility to speak on the question of apartheid. I mean, how is it that we can't understand a nation that denies you your fundamental rights in the nation of your birth? If I've got to have a pass to walk across town or around the neighborhood, there's something wrong with that. And yet we fundamentally cast our lot with the apartheid government of South Africa and thought that was okay. Well, so it was those kinds of things, Kent, that we thought about and said, we want to raise these questions with the American labor movement, and we want to raise them as trade unionists. I mean, so some people say, well, we want to be different. Well, different, yeah, we'd like to be well off. We'd like to be in a position to help build stronger trade union entities, because the stronger the American labor movement, the better chance we all will have of having a decent life and live in a decent working condition. So that was the Coalition of Black Trade Unionists. We began our work in 1968, and we're still working together to this day. And we made our argument with other groups who were entitled to the same thing: Apala, Lakla, the women's movement. I mean, all of these entities are entitled to have a seat at the table when basic policy has been made that affects not only our social lives, but our work lives. And I think we've made the case. I think John Sweeney, bless his soul, really recognized the value of having entities that really had a seat at the table to speak on behalf of other workers just like them.
Well, I'm so glad you drew the link between these different issues, because it was an act of courage when Dr. King spoke out against the US war in Vietnam. And it was George McGovern that galvanized the national peace movement to specifically call out the immoral war in Vietnam. And so the fact that the Coalition of Black Trade Unionists was born in struggle and in challenging the conservative decisions of the leaders of the American labor movement, who were not representing the interests of not only workers of color, but really the interests of all workers. And so, drawing the link between the opposition to the Vietnam War, the opposition to apartheid in South Africa, and the necessity of mobilizing Black workers for more than 50 years, CBTU has played that role. And I was so privileged to be with you, Bill, back in 1995 when at the AFL-CIO convention, we organized the very first full participation conference, right, where for the first time, workers of color lifted up our collective demands to ensure that the leadership of the AFL-CIO represented the membership of the American labor movement. And to see you seated as the vice president of the AFL-CIO back in 1995 was a source of tremendous pride, because for so many years, critical, Black leaders and other workers of color who had been ignored in terms of leadership positions were finally recognized back in 1995.
Well, one of the things that's so ironic, Kent, is that the world did not come to an end in 1995. It continued to circle around through the solar system. Part of what we all argued for then and we argue for now Um, our concern is to how do we build the strongest trade union movement, and that movement have the power to impact the conditions under which workers work and their families grow, and we have a good education system. We have all the things that make life worth living. You know, the theory of how we need to organize, we always argued against that. I mean, we need to organize as many workers as we can and not get into this thing, well, we only need to organize X number and then with that power, move the system. Well, that really doesn't do it, you know, for thousands and thousands and thousands of workers. Workers need to have an opportunity to sit down with their peers and talk about the conditions under which they work, they live, and their families live, and be a part of that discussion. You know, I guess there's still some around from the way back when they only figure you need 2 hands full of workers and you can force everybody else to do the right thing. Well, it doesn't work like that anymore. I mean, the workers of the future are young workers, diverse workers, workers who have learned that it's through their labor that they can find a better life if they're given an opportunity to help build labor. And I think our young folks are moving in that direction. I just can't help but be just thrilled to see the things that are happening now.
Well, that brings us to the last question. And I want to thank you again, Bill, for your thoughtful insight and your reflections on not only the 1968 Memphis sanitation workers strike, but some of the challenges within the labor movement over the years. But the last question is in terms of what advice you might offer to young people who are getting their starts in the labor movement, in social justice organizing, in making this world a better place, and how you might encourage some of our students to persevere in some of their work to create a more just and equitable society. So what advice do you have for them?
Well, I think this is the perfect time for young folks. You know, it's as wacky as the world is, it is the young folks who are going to change these things to make them better for all of us. I think there's an absolute responsibility to organize. Now, if you ask me, do I think the organizing can only be done by the union? I'm not at that point. I think folks who can talk to each other about the value of bringing their collective strength to the whole process. I think as young folks who are going to change things. I think as young folks who are going to change organized labor to the point where, and I may get ran out of town for this, but it's not about a nickel more an hour. I think there are so many other things that are so critically important that the trade union movement ought to be looking at how it fights for these things. It's the young folks who are going to be looking at these kinds of issues. You can make $1,000 an hour if you got a crappy job with a crappy future. I mean, you're no better off. I think what we got to figure out how to do is how do we make work better? I mean, the role of organized labor is to take bad work and make it better. It's to take conditions of work and make them better. And I'm not sure that we've found all of the different ways we can organize. I think that organizations got to take on completely different models than we're we're looking at now. And I think in the end, we'll change some of the things. I think it's just absolutely insane that Appalachia is the same one as we talked about 50 years ago. I read this book. I'm trying to make Michael Harrington, I think, wrote the book, The Other America. Why is it that the Lord said the poor will be with us always? I'm not convinced they meant the same group, and I can't figure out why it's always the same people who are at the bottom of the social and economic ladder. I mean, I think young folks are about to change that, and I want to be around when that happens.
Well, thank you so much, Bill, for joining us today to speak to our students. I always find your words inspiring and have benefited tremendously over the years from your leadership and from your vision for the future. So thank you so much, Bill Lucy, former leader of the Memphis Sanitation Workers Strike, Secretary Treasurer of the American Federation of State, County, and Municipal Employees, and founder and national president of the Coalition of Black Trade Unionists. Thanks so much, Bill. We'll be in touch soon.
Appreciate it.
Take care.